When you think of a domain name, you'll probably think of .com, .net, .org, or maybe even one of the more popular newer ones like .ly or .io. But the rabbit hole goes way further than just the ones you're familiar with. There are even a bunch of categories of domain extensions that you've probably never heard of, including sponsored domains, branded domains, restricted domains, infrastructure domains, and even reserved special use domains. In fact, at the moment, the total number of top-level domain extensions is 1,590. And yes, I looked through every single one as part of researching this video. Before we continue though, I want to thank today's sponsor, Privacy.com, which is an awesome free service I have personally used almost daily for years. It lets you create virtual, unique payment cards you can use to buy things online instead of using your real card everywhere, therefore protecting your banking and identity info. Each virtual card you make is locked to the first merchant you use it on, so even if it does somehow get stolen, the thief can't even use the card anywhere else, and you'll also be notified so you can close the card. And you can also pause or close a card at any time, or even set spending limits. Plus, you can make single-use burner cards. At this point, I use Privacy.com for most of my subscriptions, so I don't have to worry about services that make it hard to cancel, which some do. I also really like how you can put in any info you want for the payment name and address info on the merchant site. Also, yes, there are even browser extensions like for Chrome and mobile apps, so it's really easy to create and use virtual cards anywhere. Plus, if you sign up now for a limited time, you can get $5 to spend on your first purchase. So yes, it is a free service and you get $5 free credit. Just go to privacy.com/TheoJoe and sign up. You will just need to link a checking account or debit card so you can actually pay for stuff. So again, you can click that link in the description and check it out. Before I get into the weirdest domain extensions I found, let me quickly go through and list all the different domain extension categories, and then later I'll go into more detail about them, just so you can get an idea of what we're getting into. Now for these different categories, some of them are technically unofficial, but people still use them. The distinction doesn't really matter. The first category, you're probably already very familiar. They are country code domains. So these are like .co.uk for the United Kingdom, .ca for Canada, .au for Australia, and country code domains are actually one of the earliest official categories of domain extensions. Another big official category of top-level domains are generic top-level domains, or GTLDs. And in the early days, this basically referred to any of the domains that basically weren't country codes. That's pretty much what it meant. But these days, there are plenty of other subcategories that are unofficial. For example, there are restricted generic domains, of which you have to fulfill some kind of criteria before being able to register for it. There's also branded domains. These are ones that are registered by companies usually. There's also sponsored domains, which are different than branded domains, and only certain types of organization could use a certain type of sponsored domain. And there's geographic domains, which usually refer to small regions like cities. And again, I'm going to go into more detail later. Right now, I'm just kind of giving you a very brief summary, and for these following categories, I'm literally just going to name them, and I'll explain them later. So the rest of them are internationalized country code domains, testing domains, infrastructure domains, and special use domains, which are my favorite. Like I said, at the moment, the total number of domains is 1,590. However, only 1,489 of them are actually active. And that's because 82 of them are not assigned, it's called. Basically means they were revoked for whatever reason. Maybe the company didn't want to pay for it anymore. 8 of them are so-called retired, and then 11 of them are test domains. If you want to look at the full list, you can go on the IANA website, and this is the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. On their website, they have both the entire full list of previous and current domains, and then they also have the so-called root zone database, which shows all active domains. And the IANA is basically the organization that runs all the top-level domains. They're a subsidiary of ICANN, but I'm not going to get into all that. All right, so let's finally get into some actual examples, including some weird ones. Now, before I just give the purely weird extensions, I do want to explain that a lot of the ones you look through might seem weird, but they're probably just branded domains. And these are domain extensions that are basically bought by a company and are the name of the company or a brand. For example, there's .fedex, .microsoft, .apple, .xbox, a bunch of those. And like I said, this will explain a lot of the ones that seem kind of weird. For example, .george. I was like, what is this guy named George who's super rich and just wanted his own domain extension? No, it turns out it's owned by Walmart. So I Googled Walmart George, and it turns out it's a clothing brand owned by Walmart. So that explains it. Now, I couldn't find a pre-made list of all brand domains, but there are a lot of them if you look through them. So armed with that knowledge, we can filter through and only look at the truly weird generic domains that really anyone can register and aren't brands, they're just kind of strange. One of them is .meme, another one is .lol, there's .fail, and even .wtf. I'm pretty sure the company that made these domain extensions were basically just hoping that they would be used for different kind of internet trend websites or something like that. I don't know. Another one I'd consider weird is .blockbuster. Now, that's a branded domain, but what I think is weird about it is why? Blockbuster isn't even a thing anymore. Why even register this one? I guess technically you could use it for any movie that you say is going to be a blockbuster, but then just use movie or something. I don't know. Another strange one is .wang. Yeah, do I have to explain why this one's weird? Surely it just refers to that Mitchell and Webb sketch, Number Wang. Another weird one is .dot. I mean, who thought of this one? Who thought this was a good idea? Imagine trying to verbally tell someone what your website is. They're not going to know what the heck you're talking about. Is that 2 periods? They're not going to think it's the word dot spelled out. I don't know, it's stupid. Then there's .barefoot. Now, there are some other dumb domain extensions in here, but this one is just so oddly specific. There's also .christmas. I mean, are there really that many Christmas-specific websites where it warrants its own domain extension? Then there's .ooo, where the company who made this one thought that it would kind of be a new popular one for companies that couldn't get their own .com domain. They'd be able to do .000, and that would be a thing. It's not a thing. Then there are a few blatant cash grab domain extensions. For example, .sucks. Like, obviously this one is to bait companies into having to buy this one in case someone else buys it and makes a critical website. But on the flip side, there's also .rocks. So, I don't know, I've never seen either of these, to be honest, though. And then finally, for what I consider cash grabs, is .exposed. Again, it just seems like one that it's going to try and get companies just to buy it just so they have it. Now, one thing I realized I forgot to mention is where exactly do these domain extensions come from? Now, the INAI manages the list of top-level domains. They kind of approve them and create all the DNS infrastructure to redirect to them. However, it's basically private companies that apply to create these different top-level domains, and then they basically own the licenses or rights or whatever you want to call it to those top-level domains, and they can basically charge people whatever they want to use a domain with their extension. For example, if you had the funds to apply for your own domain extension like .coolpeopleonly, and you wanted to charge $100,000 for anyone who wanted to use that extension per year, and you could only get one if you did that, well, you could technically do it. Though I don't believe it's very cheap to have your own top-level domain extension. Usually it's a business that's going to be trying to get a lot of volume and charge people per 1 year. So that's why there are so many seemingly dumb or random top-level domains. It's usually companies trying to come up with some kind of domain extension that might be used for some specific purpose and not exactly one that'll be just popular, but maybe it'll be a trend or something like that. All right, so now let's go and explain the actual different categories of top-level domain extensions that I mentioned before. And some of these are kind of weird and interesting in themselves, so definitely stick around. One of these are testing domains, but to explain that one, I first need to explain internationalized country code domains. So like a regular country code domain, a internationalized country code domain is for a specific country. However, it uses a special type of encoding called Punycode to actually be able to display in a browser the actual characters that might be foreign, not normal Latin characters, to local people. For example, you could have a domain that actually uses characters that are Chinese, Arabic, Cyrillic, and more. You would just have to register a domain where the actual raw domain uses this special type of encoding scheme for the characters. Though one controversial thing is a lot of these domain extensions kind of took advantage of the fact that some characters looked similar to Latin characters. So one example was a security researcher created apple.com, which looked exactly like apple.com, but they encoded it with a Cyrillic A that wasn't a real A. And as a result of this, a lot of browsers now actually display the raw encoding, so it doesn't make a lookalike domain. But I believe this isn't the case if you are actually in that country. It'll only apply if you're natively using that language. All right, so knowing this, I can now go back and explain testing domains, because the 11 testing domains were simply created as a test for these internationalized domain extensions. And every single one of these test domains is simply the word test in that native language encoded in the text. And these are not actually active. You can't register one of these test domains if you wanted. They were just created just kind of like a back-end thing. All right, now the next category are infrastructure domain extensions. And this one's kind of weird because there are only one of them. Now, normally I would not even consider this a category if there's only one. However, technically this is an official category by ICANN and the INAI, even though there is only one of them. And that one infrastructure domain extension is .arpa. Basically, this category is for domain extensions that aren't for websites, but rather used in the actual infrastructure of the internet itself. So for example, these .arpa domain extensions are used in something called reverse DNS, which is beyond the scope of this video, but basically servers and stuff might use it to route different traffic around, but it's not going to be hosting any websites, and it can't be as far as I know. And if you know what ARPA is, you know exactly how old this domain extension is. ARPANET was literally the precursor to the internet that turned into the internet, and it was run by the United States organization ARPA before it was opened up to everybody, and I guess the name just kind of stuck and it was used for that purpose now. And I guess the reason this is technically a category is maybe at some point if they need to add more. Okay, now the next category are special use domains, which is my personal favorite because they're kind of interesting. And these are also reserved domain extensions, so you cannot go and register anything on one of these extensions. And here is a list of these special use domains. .example and .test are really similar. They basically don't actually do anything. They're just kind of used if you need to use a placeholder for a domain extension. So say you are doing some kind of testing of a server and you just want to send a bunch of packets into a black hole that doesn't go anywhere. It's just for testing, it doesn't matter, but you don't want to accidentally send the data to a real place. Like you type in a random IP address, it might actually be real. So what you could do is use .test, and then because it's a reserved domain that is specifically reserved for testing purposes or example purposes, that it is going to go just nowhere. There's also .invalid, which actually is also kind of similar to example and .test. It basically is just one you might put in there if a domain is invalid or it's meant to signify some kind of invalid address. You just use that. Then there are .local and .localhost, which you may have actually heard, and these are actually used for things. These aren't just reserved for nothing. Specifically, localhost is used to refer to the same device or computer you're on, which is also the same as 127.0.0.1. So what that means is if there is a program that is running on your computer that runs a sort of web host behind the scenes to access that other program, what one program might do is use localhost and then the port number used by that other program, or 127.0.0.1 for that program. But if you don't know what all that means, don't worry about it. .local is kind of sort of similar at a bigger scale, and from my understanding, it's used for sort of larger DNS queries and networks and stuff. I tried looking it up, and apparently it just always refers to 224.0.0.251. But again, I don't really understand the details here, so you can just look it up yourself. Then finally, there is .onion, which is for the Onion router websites. If you're not familiar, the Onion router is basically what is usually referred to as the dark web. It basically allows you to connect to the internet through a bunch of different proxies called nodes, which are basically in themselves just computers hosted by random people. So the idea is that you'll, instead of just connecting directly to a website, you'll first connect to some random guy here who will pass it on to this random guy here and a whole bunch of them, so that there's almost no way for anyone to track where the real thing came from. However, there's also a cool feature which are .onion websites, which are basically websites that can only be accessed through the Onion router, also called Tor. And again, this is not a domain you can actually register. It's just one that basically allows the computer to refer to a certain address in the Onion router. Okay, now we got a few more categories. The next one is generic restricted domains, which are basically extensions that can only be used if you meet a certain criteria. And I believe there are only 3 of these at the moment. One of them is .biz, which supposedly can only be registered by businesses. Another one is .pro, which can only be registered if you are a professional who is accredited by a government agency, I believe is the criteria. So for example, if you're a CPA, an accountant who has a accounting license, or maybe a certified financial advisor, again, who has a license, if you have some kind of government license to practice some profession, then you can register for this. And apparently, yes, they do actually check, and if you don't meet the criteria, they'll literally take away the domain. And the third one is .name, which is apparently meant to be used for individuals, but I've never seen anyone actually use it. All right, we're almost done. We got 2 more categories, and the next one is sponsored top-level domain extensions. And these are pretty similar to the restricted domains we just talked about, and they are only allowed to be registered by certain organizations. For example, .gov obviously can only be registered by government organizations, specifically in the United States. .mil is for .military. .edu is for educational institutions that are accredited, so universities or schools and stuff. But then there are some other interesting ones you may not have heard of, such as .post, which is for postal service organizations like the US Post Office or Canadian Post or the Royal Post. I forget what they call it in other places. I guess they could get a post extension if they wanted. Or there's .museum, so if you're a museum, you can get a special one. And there are several other ones, but I'm not going to go over every single one. Finally, we can mention geographic top-level domains, which just refer to a specific regional location, usually a city. And there are a whole bunch of these for major metropolitan areas like .nyc, obviously for New York City. There's also .vegas, .berlin, London, Paris, Tokyo, Moscow, Budapest, and I guess these cities just decided they had the funds to get their own domain extension if they wanted it. And there are plenty more, of course, so you might be able to look up if your own city has an extension, and there might be a rule that if you live in the city, you can register for one of them. I don't know. So I think that pretty much covers it. You might have learned more than you bargained for on this one. So thanks again to privacy.com for sponsoring this video, and be sure to visit privacy.com/TheoJoe for that $5 credit to spend on your first purchase, limited time only. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to subscribe, also be sure to click the bell next to the subscribe button so you don't miss any videos. I only upload about twice a week, so you don't want them to get lost in the rest of your subscriptions. Also be sure to click the like button for the YouTube algorithm, and if you want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is one where I was talking about why sometimes you see www.1 in front of a website. So I explain that right there. You can click on it and watch it. So thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.